So this is why I'm not a mythicist, why I'm not one of those people who does not believe that Jesus Christ lived at all. It's to do with the story of the Nativity, or rather with the four different Gospels and their different accounts of the Nativity. You see, the very first Gospel written was not the Gospel of Matthew, it was the Gospel of Mark. And that was written somewhere around 55 AD, so some 25 or so years after the crucifixion of Jesus. In Mark's Gospel, you don't get to know about his birth. He was born somewhere, presumably Nazareth, but there's no account of his birth. It begins with him being baptized by John the Baptist in the Jordan. Okay, fair enough. The story goes on from there. It's only in the second Gospel to be written, which is the first one in the New Testament, Matthew, so this one appears first, where this guy is introduced as someone from Nazareth who was born in Bethlehem. And the reason he was born in Bethlehem is because Matthew was writing his Gospel around 10 years later, so around 65 AD. Matthew was writing his Gospel to try and persuade the Jews that this was the Messiah. And according to Jewish tradition, the Messiah would be born of David's line, which is why Matthew gives you this very contrived genealogy, and in David's town, which is Bethlehem. And he actually contrives a way to get Jesus from Nazareth to Bethlehem using a Roman census. Now, there are a couple of problems with this. First of all, the Roman census would not have been anything to do with asking people to move to where their ancestors had lived 1,000 years earlier. Yet, according to Matthew, this census, which by now is not very well remembered, had Joseph and Mary move to Bethlehem because that's where David, King David, had lived 1,000 years before. There's another problem here. It's to do with the dates. You see, that Roman census did happen, but it happened in 6 AD, and it was for taxation purposes, and it simply made a note of where people were and what their financial potential was for taxation purposes. You'll remember, if you know your Gospels, that around that time, Herod the Great, having got wind that there was some important king about to be born, had all the firstborn babies killed in an attempt to prevent Jesus. And in order to save the baby Jesus' life, Joseph and Mary then fled to escape Herod the Great's cull, and they either went to Egypt or back to Nazareth, depending upon which Gospel you read. Problem with that is the census was in 6 AD, and yet the slaughter of the innocents happened in Herod the Great's lifetime, and he died in 6 BC, 12 years earlier. So that doesn't really work either. But we still had to have some way to get Jesus to Bethlehem and then back to Nazareth, be it by the circuitous route of going to Egypt first or straight to Nazareth. And depending upon which Gospel you read, be it Matthew or John, that you'll choose one of the other. Both of them end up in Nazareth. Now, this is my reasoning. First of all, I don't believe this nonsense about a census. It's completely implausible, so there's no reason for him to go to Bethlehem, really. Just why would he? And how come there is no mention anywhere in the ancient world of a census that caused people all across the Roman Empire to travel and cross each other's paths and stop trading and stop producing because they're travelling to somewhere their family used to live 1,000 years earlier. It makes no sense. So I don't believe that. I don't believe that Herod the Great was around at the time of Jesus' birth, and I don't believe in the slaughter of the innocents, because again, outside of the Gospels, it's never mentioned. Nobody in the ancient world talks about this. And it would have been a really big deal. Now, I know that, and I agree, that on the whole, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, of course. But when you've got something this huge, and you have historians kicking about, historians even in Jerusalem, which is just a few miles from Bethlehem, who were writing history at the time, who never mention it, that seems a bit strange to me. But the fact that this was contrived in order to get Jesus to Bethlehem and back to Nazareth tells me that the Jesus who was originally written about in Mark did exist and did come from Nazareth, because otherwise the second gospel, Matthew, wouldn't have bothered getting him from Nazareth to Bethlehem and back via Egypt. He would simply have made up the character in Bethlehem. You would only bother to contrive this story with all its convolutions if you were trying to get a real person to a real place. So that's why I believe that Jesus existed. I don't believe, of course, that he was the son of any god. I don't believe what you find in the Gospels. But I do believe the man existed. He was an itinerant preacher. There were many of them. Jeshua may well have been just one of many. In fact, I think he was. But he was an ordinary man. He wasn't the son of God. And when he died, he died. So that's my view. I'm happy to be challenged on that, particularly if there are any mythicists. I am interested in what you have to say. At present, I don't believe that Jesus is completely made up. He might be a composite of several different characters. I'm more than happy to accept that. But I do think there was a preacher called Jeshua, and I do think that he came from Nazareth.